Libya's story from Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year rule to the fractured state it finds itself in today is a story of immense promise overshadowed by persistent instability. Once Africa's wealthiest nation in terms of oil reserves, Libya has seen its potential undermined by decades of centralization, conflict, and a dependence on oil. It's been almost 15 years since the Libyan revolution when Muammar Gaddafi was deposed. Now with so many years separated from the revolution, how does the economy and society of Libya compare today with that 15 years ago? We'll explore the contrast between the Gaddafi era and the post-Gaddafi era, focusing on the challenges of economic and political stability. Libya was a part of the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. In 1911, it changed hands to Italy, who held onto it for 30 years up until the Allies took it over in 1943. Libya was one of the poorest countries in the world at the time of its independence in 1951, but a significant discovery was made in the late 50s which dramatically transformed its economic prospects forever. You guessed it, crude oil. By the 60s, Libya had become a significant oil exporter. The country was beginning to rapidly develop. But did this wealth trickle down into the hands of ordinary citizens? No. Much of the oil wealth was controlled by foreign companies, and while the monarchy benefited financially, there was widespread dissatisfaction over the lack of distribution of wealth among ordinary Libyans. The king's regime was seen as corrupt and out of touch with the needs of ordinary people. His monarchy relied heavily on foreign advisors that did little to build the national identity, and the king allowed British and American military bases on its soil in exchange for financial aid, an arrangement that made the monarchy, still relatively fresh from decades and decades of Western influence, heavily dependent on Western powers, further fueling nationalist resentment among Libyans who viewed the government as a puppet of foreign interests. This environment created fertile ground for the 27-year-old Muammar Gaddafi and his group of free officers to stage their coup in 1969. Gaddafi capitalized on the nation's frustrations. Inspired by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's pan-Arabist and anti-imperialist ideology, Gaddafi presented himself as a revolutionary figure. He proclaimed the creation of the Libyan Arab Republic upon taking power, and vowed to create a new Libya free from colonial and monarchical control, which initially resonated with many Libyans that were eager for change. When they took power, Gaddafi's government quickly nationalized their oil industry in the early 70s, taking control from foreign oil companies. This was just in time for the 1973 oil embargo by OPEC, which was in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This supply shock caused a dramatic increase in global oil prices. And for Libya, as a member of OPEC and a major oil producer, had its oil revenues surge. Oil became the backbone of Libya's economy, contributing to around 90% of government income and nearly all export earnings. The major increase in revenue funded widespread subsidies for fuel, food, education, and healthcare to citizens which were previously left in the dust during the monarchy before Gaddafi's takeover. Libya was to soon come to terms with the typical petrostate downfall. The lack of diversification meant the economy was entirely dependent on oil exports. During Gaddafi's tenure, oil revenues were not used to build alternative industries or foster private sector growth like the Emiratis and Saudis. Instead, much of the wealth was distributed through a bloated public sector and funneled into infrastructure projects. Which I'm not saying at all that they're entirely bad. A notable one is a whole system of man-made underground rivers designed to supply the desert country with fresh water. The Great Man-Made River, as it was called, was constructed without a single penny in foreign loans, all from oil revenue. Gaddafi himself called it the eighth wonder of the world. Anyways, the reliance on oil also made Libya vulnerable to price fluctuations. When oil prices fell, which they eventually did in the 80s, so did the regime's ability to fund its programs. The funding issues were made worse during the decade when Western countries sanctioned the bejesus out of it for funding militant revolutionary movements throughout the world. Gaddafi positioned himself as a champion of anti-imperialist movements, funding groups around him in Africa, the PLO in Palestine, and even the IRA all the way in Ireland. The sanctions crippled Libya's ability to sell its treasure trove of oil, which, combined with the falling prices of said treasure trove, led to a deterioration in the government-funded social programs, which once significantly helped bolster the country's standard of living. By the time of the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, decades of political repression, corruption, economic mismanagement, and sanctions had eroded Gaddafi's domestic support. Protests against his government, which may or may not have been fueled by NATO but were definitely supported by a NATO-led bombing campaign, escalated into a civil war. Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebel forces on October 20th, 2011, marking the end to his 42-year regime. Many were very optimistic amidst the downfall of Gaddafi. They thought it could possibly mark the beginning of a new era. But it came at the cost of Libya's unity. Libya lacked the institutions capable of managing the transfer of power. You see, Obama did not learn from Bush's mistake. Just like how Saddam's death in 2003 opened the power vacuum in Iraq, Gaddafi's death left Libya in chaos, with competing factions struggling for power, a legacy that continues to affect the region to this very day, 13 years later. The country remained in a near constant state of civil war from Gaddafi's death up until 2020, when a United Nations brokered ceasefire was signed. There are two main factions that hold control of the land today. The government and national unity controls the capital and the western parts of the country, which contain about 60 to 65% of the country's population. The Libyan National Army controls the eastern regions, including the city of Benghazi, with about 25 to 30% of the country's population. The southern desert regions are sparsely populated by tribal communities, making up only about 10 to 15% of the country's population. Neither faction controls these southern regions at the moment. The two factors operate independently of one another. There are talks of political unification, but they each just have their own vision of how to run Libya as a whole, and besides stopping the violence to a certain extent, they have not been able to make some kind of compromise to unify the country. So, as far as the economy, Gaddafi's centralized approach to economic management had allowed him to maintain control, but with his expenses. So, similar to a Soviet economy, public sector employment was widespread with low productivity bureaucratic roles with almost no oversight or accountability from higher ups. Meaning that a lot of people had cushy jobs with a nice cushy government pay, but did virtually no work. The subsidies that the government provided to citizens were great, but they also kept them dependent on the state, which hurt private sector growth. The lack of private businesses and investment meant little innovation or initiative from the general population. In other words, the repression of entrepreneurship under Gaddafi, coupled with the acceptance that the government would provide basic needs, took the soul out of the country's potential future innovators. Oil has been both Libya's blessing and its curse. Under Gaddafi, oil revenues were tightly controlled by the state, which provided a consistent stream of income. Post-2011, oil remains the backbone of Libya's economy, accounting for over 90% of government revenues. But, as we said before, the Libyan state is now fragmented. Oil is now a source of conflict rather than unity. Rival factions battle for control of oil fields and their revenues. Libya's central bank, which manages these revenues, has been caught in a crossfire with competing authorities in the east and west disputing its leadership. Even this year, in 2024, 4 years after a ceasefire was signed, these tensions reached a boiling point where the Western Tripoli-based government attempted to replace the longtime central bank's governor, leading to a suspension of oil production in areas controlled by Eastern forces. The resulting disruption in government revenue shows Libya's dependence on oil and how it makes its economy so fragile. Today's competing factions have struggled to implement coherent economic policies. The Tripoli-based government and Eastern factions have both relied on oil revenues to sustain their operations, but with little coordination or transparency. Corruption remains rampant, and a shadow economy has flourished in the absence of the effective centralized oversight that once upon a time existed. Inflation, currency devaluation, and frequent disruptions in oil production have further eroded Libya's economic stability. While Gaddafi's era saw wealth concentrated in the hands of a select few, today's wealth sees that wealth contested by many. In either case, it's to the detriment of ordinary people. But nowadays, very little of this wealth trickles down to them in the form of social programs like they once did. Let's talk security. Gaddafi's security strategy was rooted in distrust. To prevent coups, he deliberately weakened the national army, relying instead on loyalist militias and his sons to maintain control. A 1000 IQ move on his part, considering that neighboring Egypt fell victim to a military coup in both 1952 and 2013, and not to mention neighboring Sudan too in 1989. Anyways, this decision would have long-term consequences. Not for him at least, because he was dead, but for his country. Because when his regime did fall, the hollowed-out military was incapable of imposing order, and armed groups filled the vacuum. The impact of insecurity on the economy has been severe. Oil infrastructure is frequently targeted, and the lack of stability has deterred foreign investment. Criminal networks have exploited the chaos, engaging in human trafficking, smuggling, and kidnapping. As far as the social impact, the Americans may have deposed the big bad dictator, but there remains very little political freedom. Activists still face threats and assassinations, and the humanitarian situation remains dire, with over 1.3 million people requiring assistance. The youth, who make up 2/3 of Libya's population, have been disproportionately affected. Unemployment is rampant, and many young people have turned to armed groups or sought to migrate in search of better opportunities. Education has been disrupted, and drug abuse is on the rise. The future is uncertain. We've talked about a tale of two Libyas. Gaddafi's centralized regime may have been oppressive to those that denounced them, but it offered order and kept the country in line. After his fall, despite the promises of democracy, the new era has been marked by division, violence, and instability. Yet, the resilience of the Libyan people offers hope. Libya's future depends on grappling the issues that have plagued it both during and after the Gaddafi era. But fixing these issues is always much easier said than done. To move forward, Libya must learn from its past. By addressing its economic, social, and political challenges, it can build a future that honors those who fought for freedom in 2011. The road ahead is long, but with unity and reform, Libya has the potential to rise from the shadows of its history and reclaim its place as a prosperous nation.